All right. Well, it's very good to see everybody. Glad you're able to make it this morning. We are still digging in on the looking at the poetic devices so that we can analyze Psalm 99 together. Let me, I selected the wrong. Let's see here, sorry, hold on one moment. There we go. Okay. Hopefully, can everybody see the notes on the screen? It's okay? All right. I had a little trouble Monday with this, so I'm not sure what happened, but it recorded funny, so just wanted to make sure everyone can see it. Okay, well, as I said, we're still in step 4 here, poetic analysis. Lord willing, getting closer to the end so we can move forward from that. We are in the 4th part of the poetic analysis and focusing on poetic devices. And poetic devices, again, encompasses figures of speech, figurative language, and then there are some other kinds of poetic devices that aren't figures of speech, but we see them used often in poetry. We started looking at that last week at the very end. We looked at a couple of examples, so I'm just going to review those with you, and then we will do some examples together. And then we will turn our attention to Psalm 99 and look for these other poetic devices. We've already looked at Psalm 99 and looked through all of the figures of speech in that psalm. So we've covered that part of it. But like I said, there are some other kinds of devices that poets typically use in Hebrew poetry that it's important to see. Some of them are used very, very commonly. And we'll discuss that briefly. So the first one that I mentioned last week, we call Inclusio. All right, and who can tell me, what does Inclusio refer to? What kind of poetic device is that? What is Inclusio? Pastor Renee, do you want to help us with this one? Inclusio, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, Pastor Tim. Um, Inclusio, it um, normally it uh, enclose a section or uh, where it uh, begins and ends a section of particular section of psalm or passage in psalm.
Okay, good. How does it begin and end? How do we know it's an Inclusio? What gives
It's
us that?
the same, almost the same statement were stated at the beginning and at the end of section.
Okay, very good. Yeah, we can think of it like a literary unit that begins and ends with the same phrase. We do, in fact, see sometimes inclusio in narrative, where an author will begin and end a story with the same statement, but it's more typically used in poetry. It's kind of like we can think of it like bookends, where it's the same statement or a very similar statement, which is written by the author intentionally in order to tell the reader that he's bookending a particular statement. Often it happens for an entire psalm, like Psalm 8 or Psalm, what's the other one that comes to mind? Psalm was 113, where it begins and ends with the same phrase, the entire psalm, but sometimes we actually see it within a psalm. And that's the example that I show you here. Psalm 124 is actually 6 verses long, but the author employs an inclusio in verses 1 and 4 in order to bracket that particular stanza. All right, so he begins it with blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, and then the man be blessed who fears the Lord. All right, it's almost the same exact phrase, and it is used to enclose this first stanza. So it's an intentional repetition of a phrase. Now, it is different from the next type of poetic device, which we call refrain. And a refrain is what, Pastor Tabs? What is a refrain? We looked at this last week.
Master, refrain is like a chorus of a song. It's repeated within the passage.
Okay, good. A repeated phrase like a chorus uh, in a song. Okay, so notice in Psalm 42 we have this entire verse actually. Sometimes it's a phrase, sometimes it can be an entire verse. Psalm 42 has this repeated verse. Why are you in despair, O my soul? Why have you become disturbed within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him. And then he repeats this again in verse 11. Now we know this is not inclusio for a couple of reasons. Normally an inclusio comes at the beginning of a stanza or of the poem. But in these two passages, they're both in the middle of the poem. So if you have an inclusio, you're likely going to see it at the beginning of the poem or at the beginning of the stanza. And when we analyze Psalm 42, we realize these are not in the beginning of the stanza, but actually at the end of the stanza. Another thing, inclusio typically only occurs once in a poem, but refrain can occur more than once, uh, multiple times. So for example, in Psalm 42, we see it in 5, verse 11, and then we see again in the next Psalm, Psalm 43, verse 3 or 4, I think. And then also, too, if you understand the stanzas within a psalm, you'll see that a refrain, again, normally occurs somewhere in the stanza, either the middle, the beginning, the end of the stanza, but an inclusio always happens right at the beginning and at the end of the stanza. So those are ways that you can tell the difference. Both of them are a repetition of a phrase or a verse, but they have a different function within the psalm. A refrain is just intended to repeat the psalm's theme so that there's a focus. Inclusio is meant to sort of enclose or be bookend a particular psalm or part of a psalm to draw attention to what's inside the inclusio. All right, but both are a form of a repeated phrase or series of phrases. All right, so those are two that we looked at last week already. Let's move to the next poetic device, which we've actually already talked about, and it is simply probably the most common, but it is simply repetition. Repetition, that's just the repeated use of a word or a synonym within the poem. So it doesn't have to be the exact same word, though it often is, but it can often be a synonym. For example, in Psalm 51, David uses repetition very effectively as he talks about, he uses 5 or 6 different words for sin, transgression, sin, evil, what else does he, iniquity. So those are words that he uses, different synonyms. He uses different words for mercy, grace, forgiveness, loving kindness, compassion. And so a repetition is not just the exact same word or phrase being repeated, but it can also mean a synonym or a similar idea. All right. Repetition typically focuses on a word or a couple of words, as opposed to something like a refrain, which is an entire line or verse. Same with inclusio. So repetition focuses more on particular words. So, for example, Pastor John, let me have you read Psalm 13 here, and then you can let me know, what do you see being repeated here within these couple of verses?
Okay. Psalms 13, verses 1 and 2. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? So the repeated words here is how long, I think it's repeated 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 times if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. How long is repeated several times. And notice too, he uses another device here, a figure, or a poetic device that we looked at earlier. What is the other device he's using along with this repetition?
Rhetoric, Pastor?
Yeah, good. He's also
Yeah.
using rhetorical questions.
Yeah.
So he combines, right? How long? How long? These are all rhetorical questions. So he combines two devices here to have a very effective impact. What is the effect or the impact of this repetition in this particular psalm? Pastor John, you want to?
Yeah.
What's
I
the
think
effect of it?
yeah. I think it's one of desperation. He wants the Lord to answer him or to hear from him, but seemingly there's silence.
Yeah, he's not hearing anything, right? And I think that was a good word you used, desperation. Like, what if he had just said it once? How long, O Lord? And then he went into the psalm. But by repeating this 4 times, and then the effect of these rhetorical questions, there really is a despair. He's not just sad. He's not just grieving. He's in utter despair. He's at
Yes.
the end of himself. He, no, there's nowhere to turn. He feels alone and abandoned. And so, when you look at this psalm, that repetition really draws that out. This is a man in anguish. All right. So repetition really has an effect here. And when he combines it with these rhetorical questions, it's very powerful. In fact, we see this kind of repetition in a few different psalms. This idea of how long, the prophets use that. I think Habakkuk even used this phrase in the beginning of Habakkuk when he was asking how long God would wait before judging Israel for Judah for their sin. And so you'll find this often in deeply emotional language from someone who is despairing. All right. So repetition, and we see. I think repetition is probably the most common device used in Hebrew poetry. I think probably every poem I've come across has some form of repetition. Now, in some poems, it's used extensively, like I mentioned, Psalm 51. But other poems, you'll see it used less, but it is very common. In fact, Psalm 99, remember, many of the verses we saw repetition used within the psalm. So repetition is a common poetic device used for emphasis, used to bring focus on a particular theme, or in this case, used to convey extreme emotion. All right? So notice that, and be careful too, by the way, when you see repetition of synonyms, be careful not to get into word studies of each of the words and emphasize, like for example, in Psalm 51, I think there's 5 or 6 different words for sin. So he uses sin, transgression, iniquity, evil. I don't know if I can't remember if the term wickedness, but he's got like 5 or 6 or 7 of these terms, and I've often seen commentators go into each of these terms, and they'll talk about, well, sin. The focus here is on missing the mark. And then they'll talk about transgression is the idea of breaking the law. And iniquity focuses on personal offense, and they'll get into all the details when really all that's happening here often in poetry is just the use of synonyms just to repeat an idea. It's the overall idea of sin that David focused on. He wasn't using these different words to focus attention on a different aspect of sin. He was using them to provide to present an artistic, emotional communication of just he was overwhelmed by his sin. All right, he wasn't trying to come up with all these different words to focus on different details about sin. He was just trying to use all these synonyms to convey the idea, I am a wretched sinner. I'm full of iniquity, full of transgression. I've committed evil. I'm a wicked man. So we want to be careful that we don't go too much into the detail of these word studies when different words are used in a psalm or in a poem. Sometimes authors will use different words to focus on different elements, but I'm just cautioning you not to assume that if you see different words to then go into the word studies and draw out all these subtle differences in meaning, because often the poet's not trying to do that. He's just trying to artistically present something, because if he had just used the word sin over and over and over, he could do that, but I think it has a more impact and it's more effective when he uses all the different terms that refer to sin. All right, does that make sense? Are there any
Yeah,
questions on
Pastor.
that? Yes.
Yeah, Pastor. I notice. It gives also if he, well, I agree with you that particular he's specifically talking about sin in general. But if we use different shades of meaning, it gives the idea of a wider range of ideas, pictures of what sin is. I'm not saying, of course, with there's a danger that we will have to be, very, very detailed. But I think generally, if we use different words, it conveys a wider range it stimulates imagination and those things.
Yeah, I think that's it's like we do it in preaching.
Mhm.
To be effective, Steve Lawson's really good at this. I think he's one of the more effective guys to use synonyms, where he's trying to convey the same point, but he does it in this way using different words, because that draws our attention. It's more artistic, but at the same time, yes, Brother Raleigh, it reminds us there's a wider range of idea, but it's all centered around a similar thought. And for example, in Psalm 51, it's centered around sin, and he uses these different words to give a wider range, but also it's effective. It has impact, just like when we preach and we'll use different words to describe the same thing. It keeps people's attention. It draws them in. It's a way to help them remember, and it also presents emphasis. When we speak
Yeah.
in a way that is artistic, uh, it
Yeah.
it adds to the people's it draws them in, and they're more attentive. If you're interesting to listen to, then people will want to listen to you. And one way that you make yourself interesting is by using synonyms, using similar words with similar meanings to convey a particular thought. And so I think often the psalmist will do that. And so it does give a wider range, and at the same time, we just want to be careful that we don't go into all the details of every single word, because we might miss the point of what the psalmist is doing.
Yeah, right. It reminds me of Charles Spurgeon. His rich vocabulary enables you to, to be image. It creates a bigger and impact on the right readers, and having a rich vocabulary really is a plus in preaching.
Yes, very much so. The Puritans were also good at this. Thomas Watson was,
Yeah,
I believe,
yeah.
very good at using synonyms, but also he even adds to that using word pictures. And just
Right, right.
it's a powerful way. When you do this, in a way, it engages the mind, I think, in a way that really helps people better understand. When you use synonyms, it's almost like an illustration. That's
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Yeah.
what you're doing. You're almost
Right.
illustrating, making clearer the point by using other words to sort of capture the thought. So repetition is an extremely useful and powerful tool not only in poetry, but also in preaching. And as we saw last week, repetition was often used by preachers. Jesus, remember we looked at a passage where he talked about if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It's better to go, to hell without a hand, to enter life without a hand than to go to hell with the whole body. Then he said, if your eye causes you to sin, cut it out. If your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. He used repetition there. He could have just said it once, and the point would be made. But by using repetition, it was a powerful way to express the seriousness, the importance, the severity of what he was talking about. And so repetition is an extremely effective tool, which is used often in poetry, and we should employ it as well in our preaching. And notice too, we don't usually see the same exact words or phrases repeated unless it's a refrain, because again, I think the variety is something that really makes us a more effective and more interesting to listen to. Okay, so something we can learn from the poets here: repetition. All right, any other comments or questions before we look at the next one? Okay, good. The next one is called ellipsis, the next poetic device that we see, and this is commonly used in Hebrew poetry. I think before I referred to it as elision, but ellipsis is a more specific term. Elision refers to the omission. Well, let me describe ellipsis first. Ellipsis is the omission of a word or phrase, but it is still implied within the text. All right, so for example, if we look at Psalm 12, verse 3, may the Lord cut off all flattering lips, the tongue that speaks great things. Now, what's missing in the second line?
The
Lord cut off.
May the Lord cut off. Exactly. Now, how do we know that's there? How do we know that it was intended to, the meaning is there, even though the words are not?
Because the second phrase, Pastor Tim, would not make sense without it.
Yeah, if you take it out, the second phrase makes no sense. The tongue that speaks great things. Well, okay, what about that tongue? How does this fit with? Clearly, the idea of the first line is there, but the meaning is intended to be there, but the poet chose to leave it out. And we understand this. May the Lord cut off all flattering lips, the tongue that speaks great evil. May the Lord cut off the tongue that speaks great evil. That's what he means, but he omits it for artistic effect, right? Again, poetry, Hebrew poetry, one of the characteristics, remember the first one we talked about, is terseness, brevity, shortness. Now, if he repeats the phrase both times, that just lengthens it and frankly makes it kind of redundant and boring, repetitive. Repetition in a bad way. May the Lord cut off all flattering lips, and then for artistic effect, he just says the tongue that speaks great things. So it keeps that brevity, but the meaning we understand to still be there. So ellipsis, you can think of ellipsis like, sounds like the word eclipse. You know what the eclipse is? What's an eclipse? For you astronomers out there.
When the moon blocks the sun, or the other way around.
Yeah, when the moon blocks the sun or the sun blocks the moon. Now, the sun is blocked, but we know it's there, right? I mean, it's dark. We know it's there. It may be dark outside, but we know that the sun is really there, but it's covered. And it's the same with ellipsis. We know the statement is there. It's just we can't see it. All right. So eclipse, ellipsis, I don't know. it's not from the same word family, but it just sounded, it's a synonym, it's similar, it sounds similar, okay? But it's this idea that the word or words are blocked, but we know that they are there. Now, before, I think in class I used the term elision. Elision is the more general term for this, and can refer to any kind of art, refers to any kind of art where words, sounds, syllables, even musical notes that are omitted from the artistic work. But ellipsis is specific to written communication, to literature. So we'll use that term ellipsis when we're talking about, in Hebrew poetry, the omission of a word or series of words that are intended to be there, okay? So just think ellipsis, or like I said, it rhymes with eclipse. It's just kind of the same idea, that the words are there in intent and meaning, but you don't see them, all right? And again, I think this is a fairly common poetic device that is used in poetry in order to preserve the brevity and the artistic quality of the poem, okay? So ellipsis, we'll see a lot of that. Any comments or questions on this term? Okay, well, let's go to some examples where I'm just going to have you, I'm going to give you a passage and then have you, oh, sorry, I missed one more. I forgot, there's one more device that that we see in the Psalms in particular. And that is, and it's highlighted here, the term Salah. Okay. Right, we see that the first time it appears, I believe, is in Psalm 4, perhaps Psalm 3, but I think it's Psalm 4. And here we see it used twice. Notice, by the way, O sons of men, how long will my honor become a reproach? How long will you love what is worthless and aim at deception? We see a few Hebrew devices here, poetic devices. Notice one is this idea of repetition. How long, how long? But notice as well, that second how long there, it's italicized. Why? Why is it in italics?
It's not included.
Yeah, it's not actually in the original. The translation added that. But see, they put it in because they recognize the ellipsis has taken place here. So that actually the poet had eliminated that phrase. So remember what I've told you in the past is I'll typically do this when I'm diagramming it in order to remind me that these were added by the translator, but the intent is there. The intent is this repetition of this idea of how long in order to convey the discouragement and despair or frustration in this case. But yet notice in the second line it was omitted in the original Hebrew text. And so that's the use of ellipsis here. And also, too, the use of rhetorical questions. And then finally, Salah. So we see a lot going on here in just one verse. Now, Salah, what do we know about Salah? Anybody want to comment on this? I think we discussed it a little while back, but let's talk about it again briefly here. What does that word Salah mean? That's not an English word.
A
It's
Hebrew
like
musical term.
Okay, it's a musical term. What else do we know about
like
it?
a
Which might mean to
pause.
pause and meditate.
Yeah, the idea, as most best scholars can tell, is it's a call to pause, an instruction to pause, either in reading or in the musical instruments that are accompanying it, accompanying the psalm, or both. To pause in order to reflect on what was just said. And this can be effective. I mean, we can learn as preachers from this idea of pausing And that's helpful to stop sometimes for just even a couple of seconds. Can really draw attention to itself. And so when you see that word Salah, that's not a word that's intended to be read. Okay? So don't read it. When you're reading the psalm, don't read, "Oh, sons of men, how long will my honor become a reproach? How long will you love what is worthless and aim at deception?" Salah. But no, don't read it. All right? It's a Hebrew word. It's a Hebrew instruction, actually, that's not intended to be read. It's a parenthetical instruction. I think I used the example before, like a movie script. Let's say if you're reading a movie script and it says, and the man, and he's supposed to say, "Come over here, son." And then in the script, you'll see in brackets, the father points to the door. So if you see this in a script, the actor is only meant to say, come over here, son." He doesn't also say, "The father points to the door." Okay, that's an instruction to the actor. All right, as he's giving the phrase, as he's saying, "Come over here, son," he's also, the director or the script writer is telling him also to point. All right, you can think of Salah like that it's not intended to be read. It's an instruction in brackets telling the reader to pause, or telling the musicians who are playing to pause in order to meditate. Okay? So that's the same, be the same thing as if I, let's say that, Pastor Jason wants to write a love poem to his wife, right? And so he consults with me because, I'm an expert on love poetry, right? And so, just kidding. He consults me, says, "Pastor Tim, I'm writing this love poem. Can you help me?" Okay, so I tell him, "Oh, okay." So I write back to him. I message him, "Okay, use this. Roses are red and violets are blue." And then I put this in parentheses, "Pause here." Okay, because I'm telling, okay, Jason, when you read this, you want to be, emotional. So make sure you pause at that one point and then read this to her. Okay. Now, so I send this to him, right? And he says, "Honey, roses are red and violets are blue. Pause here. My heart is overwhelmed in love for you." Well, no, you weren't supposed to read the pause here. That was an instruction to guide you in reading this poetic line and giving it some emotional effect. All right? That's what Salah is. At least that's the best as I can describe it. There is some argument among scholars that has some other elements to it, but I think that is the most commonly accepted meaning of it, and it makes sense. When you read the psalm, it makes sense that the poets would want to help us because we can't hear it. We can't hear the music. Some psalms give musical instruction of like how to play it, but we can't hear it. So it's a way for the psalmist to sort of help infuse some understanding as to where we should pause, what's important, what does he want to be reflected on, and also it gives that effect of emphasis, or it really catches people's attention. Okay, so when you see Salah, just what I do is I'll just pause for a couple of seconds. All right, not too long, because then people start going, "What's he doing? What's wrong?" But just long enough so that there's a pause between the end of that line and then the next line. All right, keep that in mind. Any questions? Salah can at times be used, is used as a marker, a stanza marker, to tell us where a stanza ends, but that's not its most common use. Its most common use is pause. And sometimes, like Psalm 46, for example, there's a few cases where it actually does identify or is consistent with the end of a stanza, but don't assume that. That's not the first or most common use of Salah. All right, so I'll just put that here. Sometimes it identifies or is consistent with the end of a stanza. Okay, but I want to emphasize that first word sometimes. Okay? All right. Well, let's now dive into, and we'll start with you, Pastor Manny. I'm going to have you give you a passage, have you read it, and then tell us what poetic devices you see, in particular the non-figures of speech, the ones we just covered the last few minutes.
Psalm 24, verse 1. The earth is the Lord's and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it. Pastor, it's there's an elision.
Okay, or what we're calling ellipsis. Be more specific.
Ellipsis.
What is the ellipsis?
Is the Lord's. Word.
Yeah. Yeah, that's left out of line 2, right? It should say the world is the Lord's, or that's what he means, right? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes,
Yes.
Pastor. The world is the Lord's.
Yes.
The ellipsis is right after the world, after the word world.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Again, note it gives brevity and shortness to that second line. So that's the effect of it. Anything else you see here? Any other devices?
No more idea.
Okay. How about earth, world? Those
Repetition.
who dwell. Yeah, I think there's some repetition here in this verse. Okay. And by the way, all right, I'll challenge you a little bit, Pastor Manny. Do you see any parallelism here?
It's a synonymous parallelism. The first line and the second lines convey the same thought.
Good. The earth is the Lord's, the world is the Lord's, and all it contains and those who dwell in it. Okay, good. So we see the synonymous parallelism. That's not a poetic device we've been talking about, but I just wanted to see if you remembered from our study of parallelism. Excellent. All right, let's go to the next one. Let's see. I'll have Pastor Tabs do the next one. We'll give BJ a pass for tonight. But next time, if you join us, BJ, you might get called on, so you better pay attention. All right, Pastor Tabs, you want to try later in the same psalm, Psalm 24.
Ang haba.
Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord, mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory.
Right.
I think I can.
What do you see?
I think I see a refrain, Pastor.
Okay, what's the refrain?
Lift up your heads, O gates. It's in verse 7 and verse 9.
Okay, good.
And then there's rhetoric in verse 8, who is the King of glory.
Okay,
And
well,
then
let's hold on a minute.
Oh,
If we go back,
repetition.
is the refrain
Okay.
just lift up your head, O gates?
That the King of glory may come in.
Yeah,
Pastor?
it's the whole verse, right? Verse 7 and verse 9.
Yes, yes.
Sorry, I'm trying to shrink it so we could see the verse. Sorry about that. So yeah, it's actually, the refrain is verse verse 7, and verse 9, right? The entire verse. Okay, now, what was the other thing you noticed? Rhetorical?
Yeah, yes, Pastor. I think who is the king of glory? I think it's either rhetoric or repetition because the question is repeated. Who is this king of glory?
Yeah, well, it's
And
both, right? He is
yeah,
repeating it, so we'll put it on a repetition as well. But also, it's rhetorical in the sense, remember, what is a rhetorical question? How is it different from a regular question?
it answers itself.
Yeah, the answer is obvious, or it's not a question that's being asked with the intent for you to answer. It's that the answer is obvious. So, who is this King of Glory? Well, we all know, right? So
Yes,
it's
Pastor.
but also, yeah, it's repetition. He's repeating in verse 8 and verse 10.
And then I don't know, Pastor, if we can add repetition to the phrases "O gates" and "O ancient doors,"
They're
because
part of the refrain. So
it's already part of the
refrain,
refrain.
is by definition a repetition of
Okay.
more than just a word, but actually entire line or
Okay.
verse. What else do you see here? Do you see any other repetition?
The king. Oh, I'm sorry. That's part of the refrain already. Strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle.
Okay, strong, mighty. It's repeated. Any others?
Where is I? That's all that I can see as of now, Pastor.
Okay, we have the Lord or Yahweh. Notice
Yeah.
it's repeated in verse 8, verse 8, verse 10. Glory. See glory repeated, don't we? It is part of that phrase, who is the King of glory, but notice we see it in both the refrain and in the rhetorical question. So verse 8, verse 9, verse 10, again in verse 10. Okay?
So, Pastor Tim,
Anything else? Yeah, Jonathan?
can you consider verse 8 and verse 10 as another refrain, since we have seen verse 7 and verse 9 as a refrain, though it doesn't really have exact words, though the idea is the same, but the Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. He's also the Lord of hosts.
Yeah, it's not,
And
I mean,
he's,
there's similarity there. I wouldn't see it as refrain because it's a question and answer. It's not a declaration. You know, refrain is usually a statement, a declaration. It's not usually given in the form of a question and answer. Though in Psalm 42, we did see a refrain in that it was at first a question, why are you in despair, O my soul? Why have you become troubled within me, hope in God? I think here, though, because he uses refrain in verse 7 and verse 9, that really verse 8 is sort of the response to verse 7. Verse 10 is the response to verse 9. So I would see them more the idea of repetition, rhetorical question, as opposed to a refrain, since there's another refrain right before it. That would be unusual. Good question. Do we see
Pastor,
any other devices here? Go ahead.
Pastor, would verse 9 have an ellipsis? Because the them is italicized.
Well, in this case, no, because it's ellipsis is usually the same phrase or word taken out. Here they just put it in there, the pronoun, in order to give it clarity for reading, the English. But if it had said, "Lift up your heads, O gates, and O ancient doors," that would be ellipsis. But he uses the same verb, lift up. All right. Any other devices that we see here?
How about Salah?
Yeah.
Pastor Tim.
Yes, we see Salah in verse 10.
Okay.
Pastor Renee, did you?
How about apostrophe? O gates, O ancient?
Yeah, look at all the apostrophe going on here. Apostrophe. Yeah, O gates, O ancient doors. And again, it's repeated because it's in the refrain. But again, what is the effect of that? Lift up your heads, O gates. By the way, we see personification here, don't we? Do gates have heads? Right? Lift up your heads, O gates. Gates don't have heads, but it's the image as if the gate did have a head to look up to see who was about to enter into the city. All right. But notice, yeah, he says, "O gates, O ancient doors." That personalizes this. It's a way to, convey this imagery of the entrance to the city. The picture is this conquering king that has come back from battle and demonstrated his power and might, and he's entering into the city victorious. That's the image. And so the author uses, I think it's David in this case, uses this personification, uses apostrophe, directly addressing these inanimate objects, gates and doors, as if to emphasize the fact that this glorious, mighty king is now entering. And so that, people would have seen something like that in their experiences of the king returning from battle and the gates opening and the people crowded around to see this king come in. So it'd be a picture they would be familiar with here. So notice here all the poetic devices used just in these 4 verses. A lot of emotion here. And we didn't talk about even sort of the, obviously, lift up your heads, O gates, as a figure of speech, since gates don't have heads, for one, but also this idea of lifting up your heads, that's signifying, that's a picture of identifying honor, respect, awe, wonder, okay? And that's the tone. When you preach this psalm, it's going to be, whoa, that tone of awe, AWE, and wonder needs to be conveyed. Okay, you guys catch any other poetic devices here? Okay, all right, good. Let me ask Pastor Jason to do the next one here, Psalm 36, and I'll expand it a little bit. All right, go ahead.
Psalm 36, verse 10. Oh, continue your loving kindness to those who know you, and your righteousness to the upright in heart. Ellipsis, Pastor.
Okay, what is the ellipsis here?
The phrase, oh, continue.
Yeah, oh, continue is left out of the second line. And how do we know it should be there?
Yeah.
What tells us
also
it should be there?
The oh, continue relates to the second line, your righteousness, which is parallel to the word or to the phrase, your loving kindness.
Yes, exactly. So, oh, continue. We know it's there because and your righteousness to the upright in heart wouldn't make any sense by itself. It couldn't stand alone here. Do we see any other poetic devices?
repetition, of course, the words loving kindness and the righteousness.
Okay, there's a connection there. They're not quite synonyms, but they are connected. All right. Even we might say you and your, just in this verse. How about, do we see apostrophe here?
Well, it's a direct address, right? Because of the word you and your.
Yeah, he is speaking to the Lord, so he is addressing him, but does he use the apostrophe here? We see the word O, and that's often a clue that apostrophe is being used, but what would also need to be here for it to be clearly the use of a direct address, apostrophe in this case? What's
So
missing?
would it be maybe the author omitted the name Lord?
Yeah, that would
Could it
need to
be something, oh Lord, continue your love?
exactly. Just the word O, because he would need to add the person being addressed. So it would have to be something like, yeah, oh Lord.
Yeah.
Or, oh God. Or, or oh righteous one, or something like that. But here, God, he is speaking to God, but it's not direct address, because that word "o" isn't followed by the person being addressed. All right. So here the "o" is more, again, "o," by the way, is just added by the translator as a way to convey sort of the idea of there's more emotion in the text here. But I just want to catch it, because sometimes people see that letter O and they think, oh, it's apostrophe because he's using O. But no, there needs to be it needs to be directed towards someone. So for example, in the previous statement, it was O gates, O ancient doors. So something is being addressed specifically. Whereas in Psalm 36, it's just the general O. Oh, continue your loving kindness. So again, he's speaking to God, but he's not employing the use of apostrophe here, which if he did, would only further add the personal nature of this and the emphasis. But he didn't. He didn't choose to use it here at this point. So just want you to be aware of that. Also, too, do we see any parallelism in this one? Who was doing this? Jason?
Yes, Pastor.
What parallelism is being
Yeah.
used here?
Yes, Pastor. It's synonymous.
Yeah. Right?
Or it's developmental.
Well, let's look at it again. Oh, continue. That's assumed to be in both, right? Because he's using. So we have the declaration here, the instruction, request, and then notice your loving kindness, your righteousness, and then to those who know you, and then to the upright in heart. Those are all parallel ideas. So yeah, synonymous, I think, is what's going on here. Okay. All right. Again, our focus here is poetic devices, but I just want to keep us refreshed on use of parallelism. Okay, good. Jonathan, I'm going to give you the next one here. Actually, I meant to. Hold on a second. Let me modify this. Oh, nuts. Just closed my. Sorry, give me a moment to reopen it. So Sorry, man. It's like past 9 o'clock at night here, so my brain's starting to slow down. And there's not much there to slow down, so it's, you know. Okay. Here.
Okay, give me.
Let me,
First,
I'm going to give you the whole psalm. Sorry, that's what I was doing.
oh,
All right, let me just increase the size here a little bit for you. Okay. It never hurts to read more scripture, so let me give you the whole psalm.
will I read it?
Yeah, please go
Can I
ahead
go?
and then.
Okay. Verse 1. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth, who have displayed your splendor above the heavens. From the mouth of infants and nursing babes you have established strength because of your adversaries, to make the enemy and the revengeful cease. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you take thought of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than God, and you have crowned him with glory and majesty. You make him to rule over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth.
And I wanted you to focus on the verses I highlighted. Okay.
Verse 1 and verse 9 is the Inclusio.
Yeah, and how do we know that it's Inclusio and not Refrain?
This stated in the beginning, unlike the Refrain you mentioned a while ago that it is usually within the psalm. So this is located in the beginning and end of the poem. So this is considered as an inclusio.
Very good. Yes, notice it's repeated, same phrase. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And then the same is given in verse 9. And notice too, by the way, verse 1 adds this phrase that we don't see in verse 9. So the focus is on these first two lines and the last two. Okay. Now in just those two verses, verses 1 and 9, Athan, do you see any other?
Apostrophe.
Yeah, we see apostrophe here, right? With O Lord. In this case, again, notice the way it's spelled with all caps. What does that tell us again? That's something the translator was doing. Why?
It is mentioned ago. This just.
Why does he have it all small caps here, and then here he doesn't? They're lowercase.
Yeah, it differs the title. The first Lord is a different address to the, or it has different meaning to the next one, and it's also a form of emphasis.
Yeah, there's two Hebrew words being used here. And in fact, I'm going to, because I know you always love it when we pull out the Hebrew, so we're going to do that. Praise God. All right. You ready for some Hebrew?
Sovereign.
Okay, can you see that okay? Oh, he turned off the music. He muted himself. I was enjoying that. Okay, let me, oh, what's going on here? I'm having a lot of trouble tonight. What is going on? Can you guys see the Hebrew text? on your screen? Can you all see that? Okay. I was having trouble on my end. Where are we? Psalm 8. Okay. Notice this, by the way, verse 1 is actually all of that in instruction that was given. It's a mitzmor, Psalm of David. And here, verse 2, notice it says, notice these characters, that's what they translate, O Lord. And then here is our Lord. You see that they're different? Okay, this first one is Yahweh. Right? The second is, this one is Adonai. All right, and so the English translation has "O Lord" in all caps because that's a reference to Yahweh. Whenever you see that, remember the New American Standard commonly refers to it as, puts it in caps, puts Lord in caps. I don't know why they decided not to do Yahweh. The Legacy translation that Grace Church is coming out with is going to have Yahweh there, but Yahweh is his personal name. So in the English translation, so for example, if I go to the New American Standard, notice they have, can you guys see this? O Lord, and then it's in capital letters. And then our Lord, lowercase. So the second Lord is Adonai. It means master. This first one with capital letters is a reference to Yahweh. I think the English Standard also does the same thing. Can you see that? Notice, O Lord, capital letters. Our Lord, lowercase, Adonai. All right, New King James, same thing. Capital letters for Yahweh, lowercase for Adonai. Let's see if the NIV, I believe they do the same thing. So this is a standard convention in English translation to identify the Yahweh, the personal name of God, is given in Exodus 14 to identify that with by using the uppercase letters, the small caps. All right, so just keep that in mind. I think we discussed that some weeks ago, that really what you should see here is Yahweh, our master, Yahweh, our Lord. Okay, so O Lord is O Yahweh. All right. Now, why is that important? Why does that matter? Why am I pointing this out again? Because it's personal. It's his name. This personal name that he told Moses. When Moses said, "Who shall I say sent me?" God didn't give him a title. Tell him that the master sent you. He could have. No, he said, tell them I am sent you. I am that I am, he said. You tell them I am sent you. And so that, or Yahweh, you tell them Yahweh sent you, which actually literally is he is. It's derived from I am. And so that's his personal name. So whenever you see Lord there, that makes it sound like a title, and it's really not. It's his name. It's like Tim or Robbie or Jonathan. I mean, that's our personal name, not pastor. Pastor is a title. So it'd be like, instead of saying, if I introduced Pastor Robbie, if I said, this is Pastor, and I put the first time capital letter, this is Pastor. Or actually it'd be the other way around. If I was saying Pastor Robbie, instead of saying his name, I just said Pastor. You see how that's really depersonalizes it. And so that's my one frustration with the New American Standard and all English translations, frankly, is that they really depersonalize the name of God when it's used in the scripture. So I try to remember that and just read Yahweh when I'm reading it as a mental note. But again, only when the letters are capitalized. That's the signal that tells us it's Yahweh, not Adonai. All right. And what's interesting here is how David actually uses both. He says, "Oh Yahweh, our master. Oh Yahweh, our Adonai." Here, so
Pastor Tim,
yeah.
Could we also say that as we are reading the Old Testament, that his personal name is used also to distinguish him from other gods who have personal names, like the Baals, the Dagons, the Molechs, the Asherahs.
Yeah.
So we could identify that we are worshiping a distinct God from the other gods of the other nations.
Yes. And Baal, by the way, is just a Hebrew term or ancient Near Eastern term master, actually. It's another word for master. But yeah, Yahweh, what did he say in Exodus 20 at the very beginning when he speaks from the mountain's shaking, smoke's coming out, there's fire coming out. God says, if you touch the mountain, you'll die. I mean, it's this terrifying experience. And then out of the smoke come these words from on high. And he says, I am Yahweh, your God. So he speaks his name in a personal way to the people. He doesn't say, I am the master. And he could have, that would be true, but he chose in that moment to emphasize, he says, I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So he personalizes, he gives that his personal name as he speaks to them. And, you know, it's had that effect that I am your God, your personal God. And so I think it's just important that we remember that, because there are times, there are terms, if you look in this psalm, where again, he does refer to Yahweh as master. And then even down here, the term God is used, it's not in reference to him, but there's also the term Elohim, which is a generic reference to God, like we would use it to speak of God, the one true God, but we also use it to speak of false gods, right? And it was the same in their day. Elohim could refer to Yahweh, or it could refer to one of the pagan gods. Eloah usually would be the singular use for Elohim. But when Yahweh is used, that's the name of the one true God. No other God was named Yahweh. In fact, in Isaiah, he repeats that several times. I am Yahweh, there is no other. He didn't just mean there's no other God. There's no other Yahweh. That's me. So let's just, I'm just pointing this out to keep it in mind. So we just always are recognizing that, you know, that's his personal name. It's not another title. Okay, that's not a poetic device. That's just something I'm throwing in to remind you. But we do see apostrophe here, that personalization. Okay.
In verse 3.
Yeah, go ahead.
In verse 6, anthropomorphism. The use of the
Yeah,
word
there's a lot of devices all through here.
fingers.
Yeah, fingers.
Hands.
Where was the other one?
Can
Yeah,
we-
hands, verse 6. Yeah, this
hands.
anthropomorphism, because it's God being described with human characteristics. We see elision, right? You've put all things under his feet. You have put is left out in verse 7. All sheep and oxen and beasts of the field.
Also,
Repetition.
Pastor Tim,
What's that?
sorry. Isolation also in verse 3, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, when I consider the moons and the stars, which have ordained. Can we consider that?
Yeah, I think that's merism. That's totality. He's talking about the extremes, the heavens, the moon, and the stars. But the main thing I wanted you to focus on, as you did, was verses 1 and 9, to note the inclusio there. And in this case, it's the entire psalm, where he begins and ends the whole psalm this way. All right? Okay, good. Let's do Pastor Robbie. We'll give you, oh, I did it again. I wanted to give you verses 4 through 11 for this particular psalm. Let me do that right now. Rather than just those two verses. All right, if you could give me a moment, put those in. Can you read that? All right, let's do it to this font here. Okay. If you could go ahead and read that. And then again, I want you to just focus on the highlighted verses.
Yeah.
But read the whole
There is a
section.
river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy dwelling places of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She will not be moved. God will help her when morning dawns. The nations made an uproar. The kingdoms tottered. He raised his voice. The earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has wrought desolations in the earth. He makes wars to cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariots with fire. Cease striving and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. The highlighted verses are a refrain to the whole psalm.
Okay, and again, we see the repetition there. The exact same two lines are repeated. How do we know this is not, how would we know this is not inclusio?
Because the first of the verses does not appear at the beginning of the stanza.
Yeah, these are both
Yeah.
at the end of a stanza.
At the
I
end,
left out
yeah.
verses 1 to 3, but yeah, good. So it's not inclusio because verse 7 is not the beginning of a stanza. It is actually the end. What else do we see here? Any other poetic devices in particularly those two verses?
In those two verses?
Yeah.
Tim?
Yeah. There's one other one that pops out. It's a word you did not read.
Selah.
Yeah,
Selah.
correctly.
Yeah. Selah.
Yeah, notice Selah is in verse 7 and 10. And actually, if I were to add the first 3 verses, which I'll go ahead and do. I'm going to try to do. Okay, the font might be a little different, but notice Selah is also here at the end of verse 3. And this is one of the examples that I talked about where Selah can be used as a reference to a stanza marker. And in this case, it appears to be that way in the psalm. If we were to study the whole psalm, which I think we did a few years ago in class, we would find that verses 1 to 3 forms one stanza based on the theme, the focus. Verses 4 to 7 and verses 8 through 11 are each of the stanzas. And notice they all end with Selah. So this is one of the few times that we do see Selah seeming to be used as or coinciding with the end of the stanza. All right. But what tells us that these are stanzas is not just the use of Selah, but also the focus on different themes, the refrain used in verse 7 and also in verse 11. Okay. So, but this is, like I said, one example where Selah does appear to be a marker, a stanza marker for us. All right. Now there's other devices in this poem, but I just wanted to focus on those two verses in particular. And notice, by the way, the term Lord here, Yahweh of hosts. Again, his personal name. And then the God of Jacob, God there is Elohim. But it's also made a little personal by the fact that it's the God of Jacob, not just any God, but the particular one who declared himself and his relationship to Israel. All right. But Yahweh of hosts there, note that it is mentioned. And we see God referenced here in verse 4, verse 5, verse 5, verse 10. That's the generic term Elohim. Okay. All right. Any questions or comments on that? Anything so far? What I'd like us to do at this point is now go to Psalm 99 and let's identify the other poetic devices used. We've already identified the figures of speech within this psalm, so we're not going to go through that part again, but these other devices, ellipsis, refrain, inclusio, repetition, salah, see if we can identify those within Psalm 99. So I'm going to ask BJ, I'm going to ask you to read, in this case I'm going to have you read the whole psalm, all right? Verses 1 through 9, Psalm 99.
Sure. Verse 1, the Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He is enthroned above the cherubim, let the earth shake. The Lord is great in Zion, and he is exalted above all the peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he. Verse 4, the strength of the king loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Verse 5, sir, exalt the Lord our God, and worship at his footstool. Holy is he. Moses and Aaron were among his priests, and Samuel was among those who called on his name. They called upon the Lord, and he answered them. He spoke to them in the pillar of cloud. They kept his testimonies and the statute that he gave them. Verse 8, O Lord our God, you answered them. You were a forgiving God to them, and yet an avenger of their evil deeds. Exalt the Lord our God, and worship at his holy hill, for holy is the Lord our God.
And notice the repetition again of, I am just giving you guys one now. Yahweh our God, we see throughout the psalm. But let's consider this, the other devices, so the repetition. So if you have Psalm 99 somewhere handy that you can look at while we're going through, so I don't have to go back and forth on the page. But what's some repetition that we see within this psalm? I already gave one away. We see Yahweh that's mentioned quite often, verses 1, 2, 5, 6, verse 8, verse 9 again, and then also Yahweh our God. So I'll give you this, verses 5 and 8 and 9. In fact, 9 he mentions twice. Okay, what are some other repetition that you see in this psalm? And again, remember, go ahead.
Holy is he.
Yeah, holy is he.
Yes.
Where do we see
Verse
that?
5.
5.
And verse 3 and 5.
3 and 5, and then 9, holy is Yahweh our God. Okay,
9.
Good. Any other repetition?
He answered them.
Okay, yeah, he answered them, and that's in more than just one verse, right? Verse
6 and 8.
And 8.
Yeah.
Exalt the Lord our God, verse 5 and 9.
Yeah, exalt, and I would add to that praise, because it's of a similar idea. Again, remember, we're not just looking for the exact same word, but also synonyms. Any others that stick out?
Reigns, enthroned.
Yeah, great, enthroned.
Great.
What was the other one? Reigns, is that what you said?
Reigns, yes.
Exalted. Exalted is the Lord our God. All of these, right? In verse 1, I think it's repeated in verse 1. Verse 2 is repeated. Verse 3. We see all these terms that focus on his greatness, his exaltedness.
Worship also.
Yeah, worship's repeated a couple of times, right? Verses,
Yes.
was it 5 and 9 or 5 and 9, right? We might even put,
Worship, praise.
yeah, we could put it together with exalt and praise. It's conveying similar idea. Any other repetition that you see?
How
Justice.
about Zion, Holy Hill, and Footstool?
Okay, yeah, Zion, Holy Hill, footstool, all seem to be a reference to the ark or the temple. All right, good. And then I heard justice. Here we have justice, equity, and righteousness. They're all in verse 4, but there's a lot of repetition there. Okay, good. All right, again, notice a lot of repetition. This is just 9 verses. And notice all the repetition that we see here in this psalm. Very common. But the ones that stick out to me are the first 3 here. Okay? And then also I would say exalt, praise, and worship, because those are part of what is in the next category of refrain. What refrain, do we see any refrain used here in this psalm?
Verses 5 and 9 are refrains.
Holy is He, holy is the Lord our God.
Yeah, that's in verses 3, 5, and 9. Now, how do we know this is not Inclusio?
It's just
Not in the beginning.
Yeah, because these are at the end. The end of the stanza. Okay, not at the beginning. And remember, we did that detailed analysis, where we determined that the stanzas are verses 1 to 3, verses 4 to 5, verses 7 to 9, based on that repeated phrase at the end, but also based on the change in subject from each one, and also based on even the structure, where we had the declarations and then a command, declarations, command. So we can be sure there's 3 stanzas here, and therefore this is not Inclusio, because these are occurring at the end, each of those. And then verses 5 and 9, really, verses 5 and 9 are fully repeated, the entire verse, except for the one reference to footstool and Holy Hill. Both are reference, as I said, to the ark, the temple area. Okay? So we see refrain, that is used, again, a form of repetition, but specific to an entire line, or in this case, a couple of lines. How about ellipsis? Is there any ellipsis employed within this psalm? Any place where a word or a phrase has been omitted? You guys see any? I caught one, and it might be hard to see.
How about in verse 7?
Okay, what's in verse 7? Or not in verse 7,
They kept his testimony. They kept his testimonies and the statute that he gave them.
Yeah, they kept is left out of line 3.
2 and 3. Yeah.
It's in line 2, but not in line 3. Okay? That's the only one that I caught, so it's not a significant one. Okay, how about Inclusio? Is there any Inclusio here in this psalm? We saw refrain, but did we see any Inclusio? No, I didn't see any, so I just put none. Any salahs? within this psalm that we saw? None. Okay? So that's all we're looking for, really, in this step, is just these other poetic devices. What do we see now? Again, repetition is going to be typically the big one that we're going to find. But I think every poem you'll see some form of repetition, but you may not see any of the others. And notice in this poem, there's only one minor ellipsis, no inclusio, no sola, and then just the refrain, the one refrain. All right. So most of these other devices, it's the repetition that we see a lot of. And in fact, when we look at the psalm overall, if you remember the analysis we did a few weeks ago on the figures of speech, really repetition is the dominant poetic device used in this psalm. A lot of repetition. All right. So as we think
How about
about
apostrophe, Tim?
apostrophe, yeah, in verse 8, verse 8 we see it. O Lord our God. All right. And we caught that, I think, when we went through the figures of speech, the other, the direct address there. Very personal psalm. So all of this repetition, in particular, and the refrain here, what is the effect of these devices as we consider Psalm 99? What does this repetition convey? What does the refrain do within this psalm?
It helps us identify the theme.
Press 1.
Yeah, refrain helps us identify the key theme, we could say theological focus of this psalm, which is what?
Holy is he.
Holy is he. And the repetition, I think, gives the emotion and the emphasis, right? That, oh Yahweh, our God, oh Yahweh, Yahweh, Yahweh. He mentions, right, several times the personal name of God, so, which is kind of interesting because remember the concept of holiness, and we haven't yet done our word studies, but that term holy, right? Holy has the idea of what? Normally speaking, if we were to look at the word holy in the Bible.
Unique, being set apart, unique.
Yeah, the idea of being set apart. So we could think of God as the set apart one. When it says God is holy, he is utterly unique and above, distinct from creation. Holiness, people often focus on the moral aspect, the idea of without sin, and that certainly is true, but it's really that God is perfectly holy. I mean, he's the sinless one, so he is unique in that area as well, in the moral area. He's the only person in the universe that is completely perfectly holy. The angels are holy in the sense they have not sinned. God is holy, not just that he has not sinned, but that his essence and being, it's impossible for him. He's utterly unique morally. But he's also, that's a subset of his holiness. Holiness overall is this idea of the otherness of God, the uniqueness, the aboveness. You think the otherness of God, that there's no one like him in the universe. And so this psalm is rather interesting in how it presents God's holiness. It repeats that term, holy is he, holy is he, holy is Yahweh. But if you notice in each stanza, there's a different emphasis on a certain aspect of his holiness. In the first three verses, it was the transcendence, the greatness of God, that his majestic holiness is what scholars refer to that as, that he is so far above, that he's unlike any other being, right? The cherubim are, you know, at his footstool. Remember, he's enthroned above the cherubim. He's above all things. But then in verse 4 and 5, the focus is his holy. It talks about his justice, his equity, his righteousness. And then it says, holy is he. And then verses 7 through 9, the focus is on the fact that he's a God we can call to and he answers, and that he's forgiving, a forgiving God, merciful God. So there's a different emphasis in each stanza, though each one ends with this idea of holiness, this statement, but there's a focus on a different aspect of his holiness or his otherness. Even that last stanza, if you think about the otherness of God and his mercy. How is God, and we're jumping ahead, but I think this is an important point just for us to think about as pastors. How is God unique or holy, set apart in his mercy? There in verse 6 and 7, it talks about the fact God answered the prayer of those particular men, that he actually heard and listened. And remember, he says, "O Lord our God," as if, you know, that emphasized his amazement and wonder that God would respond. You answered them. You were a forgiving God, an avenger of evil deeds. That focuses on his mercy, his willingness to listen and to respond. But how does that show his holiness? What do you guys think?
The word yet, Pastor Tim.
Okay, yet. And what does that tell us about his holiness?
And yet an avenger of evil deeds. So there's a contrast.
There's a contrast in what?
In his one being forgiving, being one who answers prayers, and yet he does not by no means let go of evil deeds.
Yeah, so what does this remind us of? He had just talked about in verses 4 and 5 the moral holiness of God, you know, that he is just, that he is righteous, that he is equitable. So that conveys the sense of the moral holiness of God. And then in verses 6 through 9, there's this discussion of, or description of him as showing mercy. And then that phrase is thrown in, yet he's an avenger of evil deeds. What is that emphasizing here? How does that show God is other than us in this way, in his mercy? Because cannot people be merciful and show mercy to others? We're commanded to, in fact, right? We're called to show mercy. But how is God holy in his expression of mercy? In other words, how is he different than us? Unique?
Well,
Go ahead.
He will never compromise his holiness in showing mercy. He is someone who shows mercy to people who don't deserve it. Someone who's perfectly holy, showing mercy to people who are not holy. Whereas when we show mercy to others, it's one unholy person to another unholy person.
Yeah, there's a difference, isn't there? I mean, you might sin against me, or I might sin against you, and you might show mercy to me, right? But you're not perfectly holy. I'm not perfectly holy. The fact that God, who's a perfectly set apart being, far above us, and also perfectly morally holy, majestically holy, the fact that he would even show mercy is not even, I think, what we could comprehend. I mean, look how offended we get when we're sinned against. And it's sometimes takes so much in us to actually show mercy, right? To an enemy, perhaps, or someone who's betrayed us. You know, we'll do it because we know it's right, but we'll beg God for the strength to do it. And here is God, who is a perfect being, who created all of us, who's shown us grace and love and compassion provides for us, cares for us. We rebel against him. We sin against him. And yet he shows mercy. It's completely unlike our mercy. It's unique to our. We can express it in a very, very minor way compared to him. But I think this psalm is very fascinating in how this is an unexpected area. I think verses 1 to 3 make sense. The majestic holiness, right? Yeah, he's just great. He's awesome. He's above all things. He's set apart in that way. Okay. Yes, I understand that. His moral holiness, verses 4 and 5. Yeah, that makes sense. That God is perfect, sinless, but in his being and his nature, sin is contrary to who he is. But then verses 6 through 9, this whole discussion and bringing up his mercy in the context of his holiness, that's sort of a left turn. That's kind of, at least for me, when I was studying this psalm before, was an unexpected element. But then as I thought about it, I thought, you know what? His mercy is unlike anything else. He is utterly separate from us in how he expresses mercy to us because he's a perfect being. So the first two stanzas almost build the case for the third one, that he is this great God, majestically holy. He is this perfect God, morally holy, and yet he shows mercy. That's unlike any other being in creation. So just something to think about. I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but I think it's something to really consider. It's kind of like when we really understand the wrath of God, that's when we are amazed by the love of God. When we really understand and believe the judgment we deserve, that's what makes the cross so amazing. It's kind of, I think, the same thing. When we really understand who God is and then who we are, that he would show, that he would answer our prayers. I mean, that's why I think the psalmist is just, it blows his mind. Oh, Lord, you answered. You responded. It's almost like he can't believe it, that you would show us mercy. Oh, God, you are unlike any other being in all the universe. I think that's the idea here. So I really like this psalm because it not only expresses and talks about God's uniqueness in regards to his greatness and in regards to his, moral purity, but also in how he shows mercy. That's unique, the way God expresses it. And this psalm really draws that out. But again, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I wanted to get your thoughts on that. What do you guys think about that? We've looked at this psalm quite a bit, so I think we're all fairly familiar with it, but any comments, any questions?
From your discussion, Pastor Tim, it seems that the holiness of God is only him can forbear our transgression, and their transgression at the same time deal with it. That the purpose of his mercy is to still lead them to repentance, to keep them whole. At the same time, they're dealing with them to avenge their evil deeds is to correct them again. So mercy and their correction is still consistent with his holiness and with his purpose for his people to make them holy as well.
Yeah, because he is morally holy, he expects and has saved us to be morally holy. In fact, Ephesians 1, he chose us in him before the foundation of earth that we would be holy and blameless. Again, in Ephesians chapter 5, that Christ died for the bride so that she would be holy and blameless. That's definitely a response that we are called to. Any other thoughts or comments about this?
You wrote down here merciful holiness. We can also say that he does not only have merciful holiness, but his mercy is holy mercy. in that he will not, he will still avenge the evil deeds. He will not compromise his holiness. He shows mercy, but he does not um, um, he's not blinded to the sinfulness or the evil deeds of men. So he
Yeah,
will
and
not compromise his holiness when he shows his mercy.
that's a good point, because he kind of almost throws that line in there, doesn't he? And yet he's an avenger of evil deeds, as if to remind us what he just said in verse 4, that in his mercy he does not negate his moral holiness at all. Good point. Any other thoughts about this?
Yeah, Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
in verses 6 to 8, when Moses and Aaron and Samuel are mentioned, I know the Jews hold people like Abraham and Moses, Aaron, and Samuel in very high regard. I wonder if this verse can, even though Jesus was not yet had not yet come when this psalm was written, I wondered if this could be pointed to how there's a need for a mediator and an advocate. You need someone to kind of stand between you and God, because when they talked about Moses, Aaron, and Samuel, who I don't know if we can draw the link there, that there's a need for God's mercy to be applied, or to be and you need a mediator. You need someone to stand between you and God to help you with that. And
Yeah, that's a good insight. If you consider, Moses, Aaron, and Samuel, what's the link between them? And the psalmist here identifies one link as the fact that they did intercede for the people. He calls Samuel a priest, but technically Samuel was not a priest, right? He was not from the tribe of Levi. In fact, he was from Ephraim, if I remember correctly. I'm drawing a blank. Yeah, Ephraim, right? Manasseh and Ephraim were Joseph's sons, right? It's almost 10 o'clock, so I'm really fried now. But Samuel did at times intercede, and so he took the role of a priest at times. So I think, yeah, that intercession is what he's emphasizing here, that they called upon the Lord on behalf of the people, and that God responded in mercy. Yet at the same time, he did not negate, his moral holiness. And I think as you think about this psalm, really, the last step is sort of summarizing the theme of the poem after we've done all of this study, looking at the parallelism, looking at the imagery, looking at the figures of speech, looking at the poetic devices that are used. It's intended to get us, should be so familiar with the psalm at this point that we could essentially identify, Psalm 99 is what? How would you summarize it at this point? Anyone want to? Pastor Entz, you've been a little quiet. I haven't got a chance to call on you yet. If you're there, do you want to take a stab at this? How would you summarize the theme of this psalm from all we've looked at so far?
It speaks of the holiness of God, on the majestic holiness of God, as well as his unequaled, unsurpassing grace or something, or mercy.
Okay. All right, so his theme is his holiness, and it's a what we call a fully orbed, meaning it's not just focused on the moral holiness, but there's other elements here. Is there anything else in the psalm as we look at it that, is it just a declaration of his holiness? What would you say is the theme or focus of this psalm? It is the holiness of God, but is it just stating that?
It's a call
The
to
right response.
respond
Yeah.
in
Yeah, how to
reverence.
respond to.
Right.
And what is that response?
Worship.
Yeah, worship. In fact, he says he has two words, right? Exalt and worship.
Exalt.
So worship.
So we might want to, right, express something to the effect of, you know, Psalm 99 is a call for God's people to exalt him in worship because he is holy, or something like that. We can refine it later. Okay? But that's the general idea, that holiness, and it's not just that God is holy, but how are we to respond? He tells us. He describes God's majestic holiness and then says, praise his name, holy is he. He then describes his moral holiness, verses 4 and 5, and then says, exalt and worship, holy is he. He then describes what I term as merciful holiness, or to focus on his grace and mercy, and then says, holy is he. Exalt and worship, for holy is he. So I think those elements, the statement, the declaration of his holiness, and different aspects of that, and then the call for us to respond in praise and exaltation and worship. Okay? All right, well, we'll package that together as we move toward the sermon main point and outline, but why don't we, at this point, we've summarized the theme of the poem. Next week, we're going to turn a little bit and look at the poem from another direction, and that is what we did with the epistles, which is the diagramming. All right? And control your excitement. I know you want to start that now. I know how much you love diagramming, but I'm tired, so I think we should need to stop right now and just contain yourselves. But next week, what I'd like to do is use the opportunity to review diagramming a little bit, just because I know we can get rusty. So review that, and then we'll dive into the psalm itself and diagram it together. And if you want to try it this week, try diagramming Psalm 99 this week. Go ahead. And remember, diagramming is a little different than parallelism. Parallelism examines the relationship between, within the lines of a verse. Diagramming examines a relationship between the verses. So how do all the phrases connect within the poem? And even though it's poetry, there's still a flow, a logical flow of thought within the poem that we can examine with diagramming. So, but I'll review that a little bit with you, and then, so if you want to try Psalm 99 on your own this week, I encourage you to do that, and then we'll dive into it together. Okay? Are there any questions or comments before we break off for today? All right. Good to see you. See you all, and I'll try to post the video tomorrow if I have time. And let me ask